About the author, as I said, his name or his title or nickname was Ibn Shaykh al-Hazzamiyyin, and he was a great imam, a scholar. He was a faqih, a jurist, someone well versed in the sciences of Islamic jurisprudence, and was zahid. His title was Imaduddin, which means the pillar of the faith. His name was Ahmad ibn Ibrahim, ibn Abdurrahman, ibn Mas'ud, ibn Umar, al-Wasiti. Al-Wasiti was the place of his birth. Al-Wasit Wasit is found in Iraq. And it's located between Baghdad and Basra. So Baghdad is known as the capital. Basra is more towards the Kharij. It's more towards the Gulf. Down south, east. And so Wasit is kind of situated in between those two great cities. And he was also known as al-Dimashqi because he migrated to Damascus, al-Harrani. He lived in Harran at some point, and al-Hanbali, as that was his adopted school of law. He was born on the 11th of Dhul Hijjah, the year of 657 of the Hijra calendar. 657 the Hijra calendar in that city of Basra. And he was born into a family of religiosity. And believe it or not, he grew up and his father was a sheikh of a tariqah. Or I should say, one of the mashaykh of a tariqah. And the tariqah that his family followed was what they call a tariqah al-Ahmadiyya, which is better known today as al-Rifa'iyya. And it's one of the Sufi orders that started 100 and some years before he was born, after the founder Ahmad al-Rifa'i. And you can find that is still present today in some form or fashion. And so he grew up there as his father being one of the leaders of this tariqah. He, at a young age, however, would avoid the gatherings of those that followed this particular order. He found that there were a number of strange practices that they embarked upon. Instead, he sought the company of the jurists of his city, the fuqaha, those that studied and taught Islamic law. In particular, Sheikh Izzuddin al-Faruti. He was one of the Shafi'i scholars of the region, a leading authority at that particular time. And so he began his pursuit of Islamic law within the Shafi'i school. And so that was his beginning. So you can see kind of an upbringing of piety, if you will, and of, I should say, an inclination towards religiosity, an inclination towards pursuits of the heart, having grown up in a house where your father was a leader of a Sufi order, and then also the pursuit of Islamic knowledge when it comes to fiqh, jurisprudence, etc. So after some time studying in his region, he eventually began to travel around. And this is what happens when you kind of absorbed what you could. It's almost like a graduation of sorts during that time. It's much like we finish high school and we go off to college. Like you finish what your region has to offer you, you've completed your studies, and then you're gonna go out somewhere and look for something more. And so he traveled, he visited Baghdad, Cairo, Mecca, other major cities, and he became very proficient in fiqh and various other Islamic subjects. He traveled to Damascus, and this was the capital, if you will, of Islamic knowledge. Damascus has always been a stronghold of the Islamic sciences over the history of our tradition. And he traveled there, and he met with Shaykh al-Islam Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, and while he was traveling, before he reached Damascus, as I mentioned, when he was a younger pupil, he kind of avoided the circles of the Ahmadiyya, Rifa'iyya, that Sufi order. And when he arrived in, I believe, Egypt, Cairo, he stumbled across another tariqah, which is still present today, Shadhiliyya, which is another Sufi order. And he became rather attached to that particular order. He found that they had some practices, level of worship and religiosity that he was inclined towards, and he adopted that way. And then when he arrived to Damascus and he met with Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam here encouraged the great Imam to study the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, to study the biography of our leader and example, who is really, the example of all things, including pursuits of spirituality, of religiosity, of purifying the heart, cleansing the heart, purifying the soul, ridding oneself of vile and loathsome characteristics and manners. And so he began to study the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, along with his ahadith, narrations and traditions. And during this time, while he was there in Damascus, having begun that pursuit, he changed his school from Shafi'i school to Hanbali school. And this is something that happens throughout the lives of the great scholars and imams. They may have started and studied one and became very proficient, and then for one reason or another, maybe it was because of convenience, what's available, or because they saw something in another school of thought that spoke to them, or that resonated, or that appeared to be better or more virtuous. And so Ibn Shaykh al-Hazzamiyyin here, he adopted the legal school of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah ta'ala. And then it says after he completes his studies, the Imam here, he began teaching and authoring, teaching and authoring books. He wrote many books. He wrote numerous treatises and explanations. It was said that he despised innovations and deviances in creed, and wrote many works refuting the various extremist practices found in mystical groups. Obviously, he grew up with that. And so now, as a scholar and a champion of Islam and orthodox doctrine, was now clarifying the mistakes and the deviances that he witnessed through his upbringing. So he wrote numerous texts refuting those innovations and correcting various mistakes and deviancies. He championed orthodox mysticism. And this is why the Imam is so important, especially in our day and age. The Imam al-Wasiti is extremely important for us today, as he was during that time, but I believe can have a greater impact on our communities, because over the years, depending on the community you belong to, the teachers that have influenced you, you'll find that there has been a trend to strip the Islamic teachings from its spirituality, to where it becomes very dry and dogmatic. There's no spirit left to the law for many people. It's merely a series of do's and don'ts. And what's happened because of that, and I believe that has been stripped away due to a fear of falling into deviation, which is very prevalent in a number of these Sufi orders. And there's this fear that's pushed us away from embracing the rich spiritual tradition that is found within Orthodox Islam. or the prophetic practice and the way of the companions and the righteous sages that followed shortly thereafter. Because of that, trying to avoid deviancies, we've pushed aside the importance of spirituality, or as is being referred to here as mysticism or tasawwuf. And the name can be quite scary to some people, and it's a very polarizing word. Sufi, much like another term that's used very commonly, Salafi. These are polarizing terms that when you hear the word, there's a connotation that pops into your mind, and it just depends on your background and your inclination. And so for many people, they hear the word Sufi, the antennas go up. They're on high alert. Maybe even they're a little bit anxious that, here comes some fabricated hadith, here comes some unauthorized practices, here comes some excessiveness, some dancing, some twirling, some music, some song, even some shirk may be associated, some grave worship, some making tawaf around tombs, visiting the wali, paying the money, there's the murid, there's the pir, there's the etc., etc. Those things may come into your mind. And so, the same thing goes with other terms like Salafi, etc. They become very extreme, very hard-hearted, rough, crude, ill-mannered, ill-tempered, ignorant, etc. But the reality is, when you look at the early generations, the scholars, like even himself, Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam, he wrote an entire volume about suluk. Suluk is essentially the same thing. It's the same topic, it's the same essential points that have to be presented about purification of the heart, purifying one from evil and lowly qualities and characteristics. And so, because the Imam here, he lived a life and tried and tested numerous different manners of spiritual pursuit, and eventually, through that journey, found the rich spirituality that is authentically reported in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, etc., then there's a lot that can be taken away. And without the fear of deviancy and innovation, when we look into his works, we're not on alert, but we can be relaxed and we can be open and accept, and we can begin to implement in order to truly begin to work on the human condition. The human condition is very challenging to deal with and to conquer. He said here that he was well known for his heartfelt sermons. He was a preacher. His extreme abstention from the desires of the world. The Shaykh was noted to be intelligent, quick to understand and apply, and possessed a sharp and excellent memory. He would never waste his time with idle talk. Constantly busied himself with the remembrance of Allah and supplication. A couple words about him from our pious, the past scholars, such as Shaykh al-Islam. They said he was the Junaid of our times. Junaid, of course, was one of the great Sufis, or one of the great saints, we could call, of early years of Baghdad, and he was noted to be extremely pious and a leader, if you will, when it came to religiosity. He also said about the Imam, he said, our Shaykh, the Imam, the righteous, the example. Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, said he was a master, he was knowledgeable, he was highly respected. Some of the works that he authored included an explanation of Manazil al-Sa'irin, which I happen to have here. It's been translated. Manazil al-Sa'irin, Stations of the Wayfarers. This book was written by Shaykh al-Islam Abdullah al-Ansari al-Harawi, not Ibn Taymiyyah. Shaykh al-Islam here is talking about Shaykh al-Islam al-Harawi. He was a Persian scholar. He wrote Stations of the Wayfarers. It's 99 stations of spiritual endeavor. And our author wrote an explanation of this. It was not completed, the explanation. The explanation of this book was completed or concluded by Shaykh Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya rahimahullah. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya wrote an explanation and a reordering of sorts called Madarij al-Salikin. He also wrote Mukhtasar al-Sirah al-Nabawiyya, which was an abridgment of the prophetic biography which was written by Ibn Hisham. It's very famous. It's almost like one of the primary resources for Sirah is Ibn Hisham's work. And if you remember, that was the topic that he was advised to pursue when he arrived in Damascus, was the Sirah. And so, having changed his life, essentially, and his outlook and his whole perspective, essentially finding his path to Allah through the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, he then turned to serve the Sirah by abridging Ibn Hisham's work. And this is crucial. When you look at our scholars, the great ones, that is, that their histories are written and commemorated, you'll find that not only were they very academic and intelligent, but they were also in service of the Ummah. They were constantly serving knowledge, serving the Muslim community. And so when you receive good from something and your life is impacted positively, then you want to turn, there should be some reciprocity. Not that it's expected, but out of the kindness of your heart to serve that. And so a lot of the students, they would end up serving their teachers in some way by serving their authorships or explaining them, etc., etc. So he did this with Ibn Hisham's work. Another one is this book that we have, Miftah Tariq al-Awliya, small treatise here. He also wrote a book called Kitab al-Rihla, which is a book about his journey. He details his time as an extreme mystic and eventually finding the orthodox doctrine as well as religious practices. There's a couple of other texts that are also very, very fundamental. And hopefully we can look at some of these texts together in the future. So Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Wasiti. Al-Wasit, like I said, Wasit was the city there in Iraq. Actually, Shaykh al-Islam wrote a book called Aqidah, al-Aqidah al-Wasitiyya, Wasitiyya, after the city that he was born in. It's the doctrine of Wasit. He named it Wasitiyya because someone from this region asked him to give him a summarized text of the Islamic doctrine that he could take home to his people in Wasit and teach them. And so Shaykh al-Islam, he sat down, I think it was between Salat al-Dhuhr and Salat al-Asr, and he wrote a textbook, this one here, and sent it on its way to Iraq. So he passed away on Sunday, our Imam here, Ahmad Ibrahim, after a life of learning and teaching and authoring. He passed away in Damascus on a Saturday afternoon, the 16th of Rabi' al-Thani, in the year of 711, the Hijra calendar. So from 657 to 711, his funeral prayer was held the very next day in the Umayyad Mosque, and he was buried at the base of Mount Qasiyun, rahimahullah. Mount Qasiyun, of course, is where many of the Hanbali scholars were located, and he was buried right there among them. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward the great Imam for his service to Islam, and that he bless him in multitudes, and also bless us to pursue some of what he pursued in his life, and to guide us to that which he loves and is pleased with. And with that, we'll conclude. Allah knows best. Sallallahu sallam ala nabina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.